Hi, I'm Keith Whitelock. Welcome to Watercolor Workshop. This watercolor demonstration will be an old workboat in the marsh. I'll put some dark cedar trees in the background to add contrast. We'll begin with a simple pencil sketch. I'll transfer that to watercolor paper and then I'll show you how it's done. Okay, one of the first things I do here is the sketch, and we'll go ahead and work in some of the shading on the sketch. I know I want these weeds to be a good bit darker than the boat so that the boat will pop. So we'll just kind of indicate some grass like this. And this does not have to be terribly realistic, but I know I also want some weeds down in here. Like this. And then finally up here we're going to have some nice dark cedar trees. And we'll have some reflections in the water at some point like this. Okay, now that's about ready to transfer to watercolor paper. That's enough of a rough idea to let me know just what I want in the final painting. Okay, the sketch has been transferred to watercolor paper now, and you can barely see it, but it's the same drawing, very lightly put on the paper. And the first step is to take my brush and wet down this sky. So we'll just put a nice little soaking wash up here in the sky area. And while that soaks into the paper, on our palette, we'll add some water. And I'll go for just a tiny little bit of some yellowish color here for a little warmth. And we'll put that little bit of warm color orange down here near the horizon. And on the palette, we'll add some water and a touch of a light phthalo blue, and that'll be for our sky. And we'll just paint around the clouds. We'll leave just a couple of little white clouds here in the sky. And we'll just go underneath. And I'll darken it up just a little near the top of the sky. And I'm going to use some of the same color down here for blocking in the water. And I will leave some white reflections where the boat goes. And just before we let this go, I'll put a little bit of shading on this side of the clouds because that's where the sun is coming from. Now we'll let this dry down, go on to the next step of blocking in. Okay, now that that's dried down, we'll start doing a little blocking in, try and get something established. Now I've got a couple of different flat brushes here. Doesn't matter particularly which one I use. The one that looks like it has a lot of bristles missing is called a grass comb, and that guy works particularly good for putting in grassy areas, but I can do the same technique with a semi-dry brush using just a normal flat. We'll simply take the palette and we'll use a little yellow ochre. I might touch it with a little raw umber. I often keep a little scrap of watercolor paper handy just for checking and seeing how dark the wash is that I like. And as I mentioned, if we just simply flip the brush upwards like this, it will automatically paint in some grass for us. And then all I have to do is turn the painting upside down and trim around the boat, saving the white paper. And we'll just paint downward now. Using that same technique. Just being careful not to paint on the parts of the boat I want to keep as white painted boat. Now remember, with watercolor we can always darken things up. We try to get it fairly accurate on the first couple of brush strokes because we don't want the painting to look overworked. Watercolor has a nasty habit of getting muddy if we just rework areas over and over and over. So we try and make sure we get it more or less right with the first couple of passes. And again, now this area is getting a little wet, and I can still paint a little wet into wet. I'll switch to a slightly smaller brush, and we'll go with a little darker burnt umber. Kind of get here right where the shoreline and the grass is coming together. We'll just let those things creep. And since the shadow is going to be on this side, I know I can let the weeds stay a little darker over here on this side of the boat in the shadows. And eventually, some of that reflection is going to come out here into my water. And I'll just put a few stipples of that in because I want this to dry down a wee bit. Here's the grass comb brush with the missing bristles. We'll jump in with that guy and indicate some spiky grass with that brush. And while that's drying, I'm going to go back and pick up a little light blue. This is a Windsor blue. This is a blue phthalo. Sometimes I like to touch just a little bit of the brown into it. And I think that's about what I want. So we'll take that color and come back in and we'll paint some little wavelets in here. And you'll notice I use a little wave-like brush stroke that basically looks a lot like that. And the flat brush, sometimes I just zigzag them around like this. You can put one little wave. I think that works fairly effectively. We'll just put a couple of those in. When the brush runs out of paint, it will get lighter and lighter, and we can use that too. And of course this is still drying down back here. So I'll wash the brush and we'll switch brushes and try and take care of some of these really dark cedar trees. Now for the cedars, we'll take some dark brown and a little viridian. That green right out of the tube is just a little too bright. Now sometimes we'll take a little bit of this burnt sienna and throw in there. And first thing, I'm going to stipple down into the weeds. And for my cedar tree, we'll just let the brush strokes do the work. Reload the brush. And we'll just put another little cedar right there and work our way back. We can add a little yellow ochre. That'll keep one side of this cedar tree just a little sunny. Now my brush is very lightly touching the paper here. I'm really not pressing down very hard. We'll just blend those down in here a little. And watercolor will dry somewhat lighter than it does when it's wet. So on the dark side of the tree, we've added a little more brown. The shadow side of the trees. And a little of that phthalo. Just try to add a little shadow to this one side of the trees. Maybe a little texture. I think that works pretty good. Now sometimes when these trees are way off in the distance and the humidity gets to them, these trees are going to look somewhat blue. So I'll go back to my phthalo blue and we'll just put some, indicate some trees way off in the distance and behind there. And we'll stop with that. Now I'm going to try to put a little detail into the boat because that's been getting a little less attention. I'll switch to a round brush. This is a number 4. This is not a terribly big painting. And I want some shadow color. So I'll use a little brown that's laying around here on the palette. A little of that phthalo blue. And that will give me a good, a grayish color blue. And that's appropriate to this shadow side of the boat cabin. We'll just paint that on, add a little shadow here, a little shadow on the window. Get a little more of that paint. Put that on the front of the cabin here. Down the rail, just under the rail of the boat, we'll just paint along to the back. And we need to, I'll just put a little shadow here, I think. And it's perfectly fine to spin the painting around while you work. Now, the boat needs some bottom paint, and I just happen to have a little mixture of burnt sienna, a little red here, that works good. We'll just paint that along here. And since this is an old boat, that's fine if it looks a little rough, a little weather worn. Faded a little bit perhaps. Now this line where the bottom corner of the boat, where the side meets the bottom, is called the chine. And that's going to be underneath, that's going to be even darker. The sun can't get at it. So I'll go with a nice darker brown under here to define that bottom of the boat. And we'll just stipple that down in the weeds. Can't quite see him because he's laying there in the marsh. Just put this line there. And we'll indicate a couple of those boards that make up the bottom of the boat. Just paint down into the weeds. And right underneath. And while I have the same brown, we'll go back up into that window. And we'll just touch a few places. For example, where the roof of the boat might be seen through the window. Now I can always take my grass brush and get some more of that brown if I want, and just kind of stipple along underneath. And we'll throw some shadows on the back side of the boat here. And we'll make little short strokes right here near the shore where the grass is very short. And we'll just put some little random marks back here to show where that grass is growing. Now then, we've got a little spot of bright white showing through the window, and I'm going to go back for my round brush. And I'm going to get just a wee bit of that marsh color, and I'm just going to put a little tad in through that window so it looks like we're seeing through the boat. And I'm going to also take my flat brush and get a little lighter color of that boat shadow paint. and emphasize the shape of the hull just a little bit. And while I'm picking at it, I'm going to clean my brush out and put a little bit of nice clean water right back here. I'm just going to paint with the clear water like I did in the sky and get my round brush. I'm going to take just a tiny bit of that kind of rusty color, marsh color, and go back into this place where I just painted the clear water, and we'll put a little rusty stain on the side of that boat. This is an old worker. He's been here a while. Now that the marsh grass has been drying a little, I think we need a little more sunshine on it. And to get the sunshine, we'll go for a little of that yellow, cadmium yellow, maybe just a touch of the cadmium orange, and we'll brighten up the tops of a few of these weeds. We'll make it look like the sun's been hitting the tops of these weeds a little bit. And why not just throw just a tad of that sunshine on one side of the cedar trees too? It can't hurt those guys. I'll clean out the brush. We'll go back to my little flat brush now. And I want to put a few last details in the water. Now maybe I'll go for a little more brown. This will be a little grayer. And maybe we'll play with some of those reflections. We'll just zigzag that. Put a couple more little wavelets in here, especially right near the bank. A little shadow under the nose of the boat there. The closer the waves get to you, the darker some parts of them might appear. So I'll get a little brown, a little blue. And even though the grass comb and the other brushes do a great job of painting a whole bunch of weeds, there's nothing like seeing just a few. I've got a brush that comes to a really good point here, and I will get some of that darker brown, and we'll paint just a couple of individual nice dark weeds in and among all of the mass-produced weeds, and it really helps set the whole thing off. As a matter of fact, I'll get an even darker brown, turn the whole painting upside down, and we'll just kind of get a couple of those little clods of mud right around the bottom by just letting the brush do the work, going a little sideways. And I'll make my shadow just a little darker underneath that boat. And don't forget, shadows are cool. Sometimes we can go back in, take a little bit of blue where we have these shadows, and we'll actually throw in a little blue in that shadow area. It might not show up that great, but the shadows are blue, and I think it helps define them a little bit. And last but not least, if you're okay with the painting at this point, well, we'll just go ahead and put a signature on it. pretty much declare this guy finished. Well, that about does it for this painting. I hope you enjoyed watching me paint this. It's a rather small painting, and remember, you don't have to paint great big works. Every technique that you use in watercolor works just great on a small painting, and you don't have to get intimidated by the great big sheet of paper. These can be fun, they can be quick and spontaneous. They work good on the spot, they work good in the studio. So at any rate, I hope you enjoyed watching this little demo today, and please join me again on Watercolor Workshop here on Pack 14. Thanks. See you next time.